Hi, I'm David Petersen, the creator of Mouseguard, and welcome to Creator Commentary for the third series of Mouseguard, The Black Axe. This episode will cover Issue 5, or Chapter 5 when it was collected into a hardcover edition. This commentary will not have the book's visuals. Please feel free to follow along in your copy of the story in either issue form or from the hardcover, as I talk about the behind-the-scenes details, art notes, and my headspace as I go page by page and panel by panel. Also, a fair warning, there will be lots of spoilers if you have not yet read this volume or the rest of the Mouseguard series. The file date for the first page of this issue is dated January of 2012. In my outline for the series, this issue was the M's death issue. The main goal for this chapter was to hit Kellinaw, and therefore the reader, with M's death. The quest for the axe is over, and the realization of what it costs. Now to return home. Here's the original solicitation text that Archaea used to promote this issue of the comic. M, the mouse who brought Kellinaw into the quest for the axe, has met her end. The tragic tale of her death is told to Kellinaw and Conrad by the Ferret King, who was honor-bound to keep her alive. The consequences lead Kellinaw and Conrad to try and find a way home, to the Mouse territories, so that Kellinaw can return to the Guard, and Conrad can try and gain the seat of Captain's Captain in Port Sumac. Cover. Since the reader already knew at the end of the last issue that M had died, I was safe making the entire cover a funeral image of her. For visual inspiration, I turned to the Ophelia painting by John Everett Milius, and Amidala's funeral scene in the Star Wars prequels. The flowers are a type of daisy, which is the national flower of Denmark, another nod to my Danish heritage in this series. This is the first cover that I inked for Mouseguard with Copic multiliner pens. I'd switched to them already for the interiors, but since the covers need to be turned in so far in advance, it took a while to catch up to where I was using the same pens for everything. The water ripple lines were all done with an overlay sheet, where I inked those lines separately on another page so I could isolate them and make them semi-transparent, where they overlap M's form when I colored this piece. I also used a color hold, an area where I want the black lines to be painted a color other than black, on any of the lines on M or the flowers where they have dipped below the surface of the water. Inside front cover. The visuals for this intro text were loosely based on Folio 33R, the 8-circle cross in the Book of Kells. But pretty much the only thing I seem to have lifted directly are the circles. Everything else seems to be an amalgam of design ideas found throughout the illuminated manuscript. In some ways, the text for this page goes better with Chapter 6, the final issue of this series. The Lost Loves line at the start fits, but the rest deals with the idea Kellinaw needs to pass on the burden of the axe, something that really shouldn't be on the reader's mind yet. Reading ahead to the next issue's inside front cover, I suppose I could have swapped these for each other since that one deals with death, a theme in this issue. But the last line of the text here, he and the axe were forever to be one, works nicely for the issue where Kellinaw's quest is at an end. Page 1, Panel 1. Picking right up where I left the reader at the end of issue 4, Kellinaw and Conrad are in Ilder Hall with M dead on Luthaben's throne as he looks over her. This panel could have been half the height, but I wanted some breathing room. I wanted M to feel small and broken. I wanted the airspace in that place to be pregnant with loss. I also want to note a few things I mentioned in the last creator commentary. I pointed out the yellow cloth hanging from Luthaben's belt. It is Eber Oker's headdress. We will see it in place on that creature's head on the next page. The orb of your enemy's gaze, the fox's eye, is sitting on the floor wrapped in Kellinaw and Conrad's stitched-together cloaks. And that, in error, I mentioned putting the Ilder architectural model away on a shelf after the last issue. Clearly, I have enough panels in this issue that I must have brought it back out for a few pages worth of reference photos. Panel 2. In the same way that first panel was overly large, I tried to make this panel feel a bit tight and claustrophobic. Kellinaw's obvious rage is big enough, it wants to boil out of this confined space. He is ready to kill Luthaben or die trying. Panel 3. The horizontal layout of this panel was the perfect space to try to get across a lowered and bowed head to show Luthaben's remorse. Unlike in issue 3, when Luthien was ready to slay any beast that lashed out at him or didn't show proper respect, here his posture, dialogue, and the note of his measured voice are trying to de-escalate the situation. Page 2, panel 1. We go into a flashback scene for the next 3 panels, indicated by the hazy color tinting over these panels. We see Eberoker with his yellow head covering. According to Luthien, he was the healer, and never having seen a live mouse, he wanted to examine her. M is busily writing away in her book. We get a glimpse of that final page later in this issue. Panel 2. Here we have a scale issue. Eberoker is able to cradle M in one paw, which makes him much bigger than he is on the previous panel or the other establishing images of scale between the Ilder ferrets and our mice. Whoops. I'd used a photo of my own hands holding a sculpted mouse figure as reference. This is where I think the scale issue originates from. Back in issue 3, the bargain M strikes with Luthien is that he will not lay fang, claw, or blade on her. And by extension, the idea is that none of his subjects would either. One of the papers falling out from M's book is the Ferrer family tree. Panel 3. For this panel, I was tempted to go bloody. But in the interest of Mouseguard's tone and knowing another gory visual was coming in a few pages, I had Eberoker's vest loose enough to hide this mortal wound. Keeping M in the foreground was important for me here, so that the murder of Eberoker was in constant moral perspective to the reader. I think at one point early on in this book's process, I thought M would die of illness or old age at this point in the story, but by issue 4, I knew I had a chance to use her death by one ferret to help exemplify Luthien's honor code, which was a goal of mine for the entire series, to show predators don't need to be evil characters. Panel 4. Back out of the flashback as Luthien emphasizes his principles are of more value than the unvirtuous. Page 3, panel 1. My instinct would now be to reverse the camera angle here so that we are on the other side of Kellanagh, and the mice would be facing into the spine of the book to look towards Luthien. But the problem with that, and probably why I didn't do it in the first place, was it puts too much emphasis on Kellanagh as a visual. Or I'd have to have cropped Kellanagh enough so that he wouldn't be readable as a figure while Conrad is delivering his lines. Panel 2. It was hard to get the right expression for Luthien here. I wanted to make sure it was clear he was not okay with what Conrad said, and that under any other circumstances he'd be unhinged after those words, but in showing proper remorse and respect had to control himself. His paw up as a hold or stop gesture was part of trying to get that emotion across. Luthien's dialogue echoes what I've been making a point of with him since his first appearance, that he is beyond the idea of killing just to murder. Panel 3. Luthien even tried to have his ferrets mend M's wounds, but she had already died. I wanted this last bit to be close in on M, because we weren't going to get many more panels with her. The text here seemed an appropriate place to have her visuals tug on the reader's heartstrings. Panel 4. This panel of Kellanagh was also a difficult expression to draw. I think the narration sells it more than the drawing, but his staring at the axe and tear-stained fur helps reinforce it. Page 4, panel 1. I pulled back here because I needed to show other ferrets coming out of the tunnels off the sides of the hall. If I didn't show them here emerging and distant, their appearance in the coming panels where I need them would be jarring to the reader, like they just appeared out of thin air. Panel 2. Tightening in a bit on the main characters, but still far enough away to fit everyone in comfortably, including the ferrets who bow to the mice. I was thinking of the moment at the end of Return of the King, when Aragorn has the kingdom of men bow to the hobbits. It's hard to see, but Luthien is cradling M in his arm, with a more appropriate scale to her proportions and a ferret's paw. Panel 3. I looked at movie stills of Jen holding Kira from the Dark Crystal movie to try and get the sense of weight of one small creature holding up another. As he hands her over to Kellanagh, Luthien offers whatever Kellanagh needs to lay M to rest properly. Page 5, panel 1. Here's where I get a bit gory again. The skinned pelt of Eberoker is presented to Kellanagh as a gift, and Luthien encourages Kellanagh to wear it. The ferret holding the fur has in his belt a scraping tool, the kind used for removing all the flesh from the hide. That ferret is a light color, so that he would really stand out against Eberoker's fur color. As for Eberoker's pelt itself, there are openings where the eye sockets would be, but I did leave all 4 paws intact. There's a small slash between the arms meant to show where Luthabin's sword ran him through. I have Luthabin's attendant bring him his sword here. That's because I'd already planned on him raising his sword in the last panel's dialogue, and with it nowhere to be seen in the previous pages, I had to explain its sudden appearance. Also of note, this is the last time we see Kellanaw's sword. Here it's hanging from Luthabin's belt, but not only does it not appear there in the next scene, Kellanaw does not have it with him at or after the funeral, or even when he departs from their new boat on Mouse Shores. I'd implied that scrap of sword Kellanaw uses in Fall and is also shown in his trunk at the epilogue of Winter could be this sword, but I haven't given myself a good explanation for it reappearing in the Mouse territories in the fall of 1152. Panel 2. I think I also looked at a still frame from the Dark Crystal to get the pose and emotion right for Kellanaw here as well. Luthabin offers the mice a home on the island with all protections of his crown. Panel 3. And the fury of the King of Ferrets makes sure all his subjects understand this decree. There will not be another Eberoker. The vertical shape of this panel was best for this key moment with Luthabin. Often I'll decide on a page what is the most important visual, and then what panel shape holds that visual best. After that, I work all the remaining panels on the page around that one. Page 6, Panel 1. The funeral scene starts with an establishing shot, as well as narration explaining where the scene takes place. Bellisflod literally translates to Daisy River in Danish. I wanted the scene to look and feel peaceful before the service had even started. Panel 2. Since I'd already shown a mouse funeral in the Winter Book, ironically for Kellanaw, I wanted to do something different for this ceremony. Kellanaw's funeral was a pyre, so for M, I went with water. I think it was also to tie in a Norse feeling of a Viking water burial, but without the ship. It was also important to me that the scene play out for a while with no dialogue. Panel 3. The feather Conrad was carrying in the last panel is now placed in M's paws by Kellanaw, a nod to her companionship with birds, and a nod to her fallen crow mount from issue 1, though surely this feather came from one of the other crows on Ilder. Page 7, panels 1 and 2. As M goes with the current and the ferrets cast daisy petals to her honor, Kellanaw begins his funeral speech. I never envisioned Kellanaw as a speech giver, odd since I have him deliver such important dialogue in Fall and Winter, but I still see him as just a teacher who at times relays very important things, but not as a mouse who actively thinks about oration, and one who probably wouldn't want to speak about sorrow and loss in front of others. But only Kellanaw could deliver what needed to be said as M is laid to rest. He makes references to an afterlife, most likely Saiyan, where she will see their ancestors, and pledges to carry on her work, hopes, and wishes. This last bit is a bit odd since the quest is over. There isn't more to do, really, nor is there. I put this pledge of Kellanaw's in because of the discovery he makes in her journal in a few pages, as well as what he discovers in the last issue. I needed it in the reader's mind that he would continue the quest as more of it was revealed. Panel 3. The ferrets high on the rock add in their chant of "Let it be so," almost like an amen to the eulogy. Page 8, Panel 1. M drifting away, to the right as her journey goes ever onwards, is a pullback visual of the cover art, but with the shoreline, Kellanaw, Conrad, and Luthabin in for reference. I liked that in these last panels of the funeral, even starting from the last page's last panel, the visuals go from a crowd, down to this trio, down to the pair of mice in panel 2, and lastly, to just M in panel 3. This panel is also the last time we really see King Luthabin. Panel 2. While Conrad is a mouse who likes to talk, and yell, and give his opinions, I liked the juxtaposition of having him wait until everyone was leaving before he said his goodbye to M. In his farewell, it's important to note that M is an old mouse, while Conrad is still relatively young, so his guessing Em would have outlived them all is a generous praise of her spirit and constitution. Note that Conrad still holds a grudge. He remembers this was done by Weasel Claw. Panel 3. To end the funeral scene, I recreated the cover art, but as a smaller vertical panel. Goodbye, Em. Page 9, Panel 1. As the scene shifts to the mice relaxing somewhere on the island away from the ferrets, we see they both have new cloaks, made of Eberoker's pelt. Kellenaw's wraps around his neck, as his guard cloak did, and Conrad's loops over his arms like a long vest, as his old clothes did. Since Kellenaw is now transitioning into his new life, having completed the quest, it was important for me that he don his new cloak. This panel was a chance to show them at leisure. The axe close by, Kellenaw's pauldron off his shoulder, and Conrad carving himself a peg leg. All of the ivy veins were inked black on the page line art, but I painted in a color hold when coloring this and the next page. Panel 2. I'd lost both my paternal grandparents when the Mouseguard series started, and I remember the comfort and pain looking through those old photos and mementos in the following days. That you want to absorb who they were through those things, like an intellectual way of studying them enough that you are actually embracing them physically again. And also how that act can be torture as well. Kellenaw is not only mourning Em, but also trying to make sense of the loss. If the act of finding that axe was worth her life. Panel 3. And the last page in Em's journal gives Kellenaw and our story some new goals. I did a pencil drawing of the Haven Guild founders and then scanned it in and added text. I then printed out that page to scale with the Mouseguard RPG hardcover book so that I could place it in like a page and then photograph myself holding the book open for reference. I will talk more about the Haven Guild founders in the next issue's commentary. Page 10, Panel 1. I didn't want Kellenaw to demand their return to Conrad. I wanted him to state the facts and then his opinion on the matter. The wider shot of illumination on the open page shows an arched top. That's because the drawing that I used was actually the drawing that I used for the model, for the cover of issue 6. And the columns in that room make each wall have an arched top. Panel 2. It was easy to imagine that Conrad wanted nothing to do with an island of ferrets, and that he also wanted to go back to Rourke with revenge. And for Kellenaw, the prospect of returning to a land of mice to protect should be enough. But I wanted there to be more. Panels 3 and 4. Bronwyn. I do regret how late in this series I revealed their secret love, only because it feels tacked on. But I knew that Kellenaw couldn't be done with loss for that axe, to have the weight it needed. And revealing the love earlier felt like it made no sense for him to leave, even with her letter. I'm also still proud of the line, I chose love. Page 11. I do remember having a worry about how I was going to get the mice back home across the sea, if they'd ride on the backs of birds, or if Luthabin would have a ship, but I opted for them to have to craft a boat to go home. The other options would have either granted Kellenaw animal kinship too quickly for my taste, or implied that the ferrets could leave the island by boat, or had resources to get to the mouse territories, which I didn't want. I made a model of this boat and had to design it as I went, which made drawing the mice gathering and preparing supplies for it all the more authentic. I've done another video about the model of this ship that you can find here on my YouTube channel, but in short, I made a cardstock turtle shell, and then used a few small branches and scraps of basswood to make the pontoons, frame, mast, and rudders. Kellenaw's line in the last panel about understanding how to sail this ship wasn't so much about this boat being less complicated than the old one, but rather that because he had helped build it, he understood each of the parts and how they function. In that same panel, you can just faintly see the top of the ferret's head on the left is wearing a crown. Our last true sight of King Luthabin. Page 12, Panel 1. With the journey to Ilder being so risky and fraught with peril, I wanted Kellenaw and Conrad to have a slightly easier time returning home, so I gave our heroes a new route and lots of maps. all of which I had to generate mock-ups of, which I later reused for the hardcover extras. Seen only in this panel, though, is a page from M's book titled The Voyage of the Red Snapper. While I only scribbled text for the art, I did write out what was on that page for my digital mock-up, which I'm now showing here. Panel 2. The birds shown here are based on photo reference of flying sandpipers. The idea that Kellanau and Conrad are following birds as part of their navigation means they are not retracing their steps because they lost sight of all birds on their way to Ilder. This is a longer but safer route. Also, it was very handy to have the model of the boat, so I could take photos of it at odd angles, like this one, for reference. Panel 3. After all the misery and sorrow I'd sent Kellanau on, and Conrad too, I wanted to have some of the adventure to be joyful. Moments like this, where they are staining their fur with blackberry juice. To get the look of that stain right, I shaded in the blotches and pencil on the back of the page, using a light box to see the figures. When I scanned the page, I scanned both sides, and then placed the pencil marks over the inks and tinted them a berry juice color. This entire journey home was meant to be a light spot in the book. It most closely resembles my earliest visions of a Black Axe story where Kellanau and Conrad travel around having disjointed and fun sea adventures, before I decided to shape the story as a quest. Page 13, Panel 1. The narration of this panel is part of what I meant about the sea voyage home being a bright spot. Kellanau confirms these were some of the best days of his life. The boat up on one of its log pontoons with Kellanau holding the sail, catching the wind as he leans against it is based on my experiences with family friends, the Venns, and the catamaran their son Michael would sail when I was a kid. Not only in this panel, but for the next several pages of art, all the water texture, splashes, ripples, and waves, I inked them black on the page, but were carefully isolated as color holds in the coloring process. Panels 2 and 3. To bond their friendship as something deeper, I explored through their chats, and started with the stuff that hurts both of them, their fathers. Conrad's relationship with his father was a good one, but his death and the fallout that happened after, things covered in issue 2 of this book, make that memory hurt, even though it's a fond memory he shares. While Kellanau's father experience is decidedly sad, and the loss of love from his father still wounds him, not to mention that the memory is also tied with the death of his sister. We will get to see her funeral in the next issue via flashback. And as an art detail note, I want to point out the berries and leaf-wrapped foodstuffs stored under the platform in panel 2. They are a gathering as they go. Page 14, panel 1. When trying to prevent these same location panels getting repetitive, I explored my model with the viewfinder of my camera to find new angles and shots that would be interesting, and then build drawings around them. This down shot of Conrad climbing up the mast one-legged was a great exploration and provided a good context for the dialogue. Kellanau is being an optimist here in his narration, seeing Conrad's determined gruffness as a positive when coping with the loss of his leg. Perhaps that view is further fueled by Kellanau's guilt over having separated Conrad from that particular limb. Panels 2 and 3. Conrad then spoils the optimistic mood with this visualization for an angry curse word, and to make it clear that's what the symbol means, Kellanau explains its language he wouldn't repeat. These panels demonstrate the reason Conrad's flaws are dangerous. They echo back to Kellanau's observation of him being an opportunist with no desire to serve others, selfish, holding grudges, looking to get even with Rourke and the other sailors in Port Sumac. The world owes Conrad, and he's ready for it to pay up. Page 15, panels 1 and 2. Another topic I thought these two could talk about safely was for Kellanau to answer questions about the guard for Conrad. And here I could do some retcon explaining of Kellanau's cloak color being that light blue that we see at the start of the series, though in fall and winter he had a dark gray cloak. Kellanau's cloak changing from coal gray to pale blue after many, many seasons was also a nod to the idea that the mice would be using natural dyes that may or may not hold with wash, wear, and sun. It was also a way to add in some of the world-building flavor and lore of the role-playing game into the series itself, and help explain that each mentor can have their own interpretation when they give a cloak to their Tenderpaw, what the significance of the color means to the mouse who will wear it. Over these 2 panels, I also illustrated Kellenaw pouring and drinking fresh water they are storing in hollow acorns, and using the caps as a drinking cup. Not particularly efficient or practical, as they wouldn't be watertight, the bottom is pointed and wouldn't sit flat, and the volume is quite small, but it's a good visual to draw to remind us of the scale of mice. The background on these panels is also color shifting to denote the change in time of day. Panel 3. For the sunset panel, I wanted to get the feel of that shot from Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indy and Salah's crew start digging in the correct location for the Well of Souls. There was a concerted effort in Indy's design so that he would be recognizable just by his silhouette, not just in that scene, but at any time. I had Kellenaw holding the black axe up in my panel so that I could achieve the same idea with an instant visual recognition of which mouse was which. The narration here is me justifying to myself and to the audience how Kellenaw avoided all the sticky points about his lie to Conrad of the truth of the black axe. But as much as this says to the audience to explain away Conrad's understanding of the axe and its lore later in the series, it's also telling that Kellenaw doesn't come clean here. He continues the lie. Kellenaw is my Obi-Wan, and I guess this is his own from a certain point of view ruse. Page 16, panels 1 through 3. These 3 panels are meant to feel like a time shift montage. They harken back to M's stargazing in issue 2, more island discoveries not on the map, reinforcing to the reader that this is a different route home, and actually living on those lands in bad weather. The snow shelter echoes back to Kellenaw and Liam in the Winter Book. Panel 4. And this big panel was so I could fit in this big song. I'd wanted to play in Mouseguard with adding song and verse, and I'd already done that in the previous books. And since the winter songs were so grim, here I wanted something that would be a more enjoyable song. A sea shanty. Cross the sea to foreign land for a season and a day. Through gust and storm and shipwreck, somehow found a way. King of the Isle had an ebon blade, sent to a thicket for a fox to be flayed. Not an eye for an eye, but an axe for an eye, to deftly prove the slay. Grief set in at fallen kin, death sat where she lay. Sent her adrift down river's edge to honour her life's delay. Must quest cease for a weasel's flaw, when many never lay a tooth or claw, 'cause of honour's bound to make peers of their species prey. Gulls gaze down from on high with hunger in their eyes. From toss of hook or weighted stone they plummet from the skies. With axe of black and cloak of hide, immortal mouse and guard of pride, took a peg-leg mouse beyond any map is wise. A ship of shell and timber scrap, bright stars point us home. With berries ripe and seed to eat, 'tis a shame to end the roam. Too many suns have risen and slept, with time at sea to have laughed and wept. Surely be a sight to see of mouse's sweet sown loam. Surely be a sight to see of mouse's sweet sown loam. The first verse sums up issues 2 through 4 pretty quickly. I still really like the not an eye for an eye but an axe for an eye to deftly prove the slay, as another nod to the eyeball prize I tried to suggest without ever showing. The second verse is simply the death and funeral of M. The third about their time at sea. So half of the verses are about their return trip. I wanted to point out Conrad is singing this verse and mentions the ferret cloaks they are now both wearing, as well as the idea that the black axe makes Kellenaw immortal, something set up back in issue 4, reinforced here, so that they will pay off in the last chapter. The final verse is where I first coined the term a ship of shell and timber scrap, which I thought had a lovely cadence. I ended up calling it that officially in the hardcover extras as well. Page 17, panel 1. As they approach the shores of the Mouse territories, I wanted the landscape to cue that this isn't Ilder again, that they haven't sailed in a circle. So the landscape is greener, even in the distance, than Ilder was, when Kellenaw gets his first glimpse in issue 3. I know after I drew this panel, I was getting excited, knowing I was almost done with the boat model. A few more panels, but the at-sea scenes were over. Panel 2. I had them return at Dawn Rock just to do something different, not landing exactly where they had started. But as I didn't want to have Kellanaw arrive at a city for story reasons, I set them just east of Dawn Rock, which spared me having to design a whole new town facade. I'll come back to another Dawn Rock nod on the next page. The tree close to shore with exposed roots offered a visual way for Kellanaw to disembark the boat on the next page without the need for a mouse settlement with a dock. The little red dots, they're ladybugs, which we see more of in the next few panels. Panel 3. Conrad is meant to look very alone here. This decision to return to Port Sumac, it's a bad one. Page 18, Panel 1. More ladybugs, which I associate as a Kellanaw symbolic cue. I don't know why, but I do. I've included them in his scenes in the short story Piper the Listener, and also on his matted print. The pattern I tried to ink on these stones is supposed to resemble the Michigan state stone, Petoskey, which is also a city here in Michigan. The name has a connection to the term rising sun, which the patterns resemble. Rising suns on stone, or Dawn Rock. As Kellanaw departs, he has the axe as well as his old cloak filled with some kind of supplies, I assume enough provisions to get him to Lockhaven. I make use of that old fox eye bag cloak scrap in the next issue. I regret how I handled Kellanaw's departing words to Kellanaw. Not that I would change the ones in this panel. A better life is nothing bad to wish upon someone, but Panels 2 and 3. Kellanaw cheated Conrad. The poor mouse almost died at sea, his father's ship smashed to splinters, lost his leg, been lied to, and his only payment is that pelt cloak and Kellanaw's promise to come later and verify Conrad's tales. I established that Conrad would most likely be killed if he sailed back into Port Sumac without coin for his dues to Rourke. And now his tale of sailing off the edge of any map won't be confirmed until Kellanaw's ready for a visit. Boo on Kellanaw. Kellanaw certainly didn't want to use the axe as a tool for personal gain, or to ruin the secret nature of it by showing it off to Rourke, but I wish I'd handled this differently. Like mentioning that Conrad insisted on returning, despite Kellanaw's warnings not to, or offers to join Kellanaw as a companion and offer to a life outside of Port Sumac. And instead, it was Conrad's bad decision for revenge that gets him into the mess we find him in the next issue, rather than Kellanaw abandoning his friend. Panel 4. Here is the last look at good times between this duo. The last times things will ever be right with them. And the last time I had to draw that boat. Until the hardcover extras. Page 19, Panel 1. A new establishing shot of Lockhaven. I like the idea of showing Lockhaven at different points in time being slightly changed with additions or damage done to it. I hope to do more of that in the future. This era of Lockhaven has straw roofs on the tower, a smaller door within the left of the larger front doors, and flags and banners flying. In my head, I think the banner colors are meant to be the same as the current matriarch's cloak, which should be a sign to Kellanaw that not all is well at home. Yellow isn't Bronwyn's color. Panel 2. Kellanaw slides into an ivy-covered secret door, which I explore the origins of more in the next issue. The look of the round door passageway is inspired by the knot-hole doors from the Gummy Bears cartoon. Presumably, this is the exact same door and route Kellanaw led Saxon and Kenzie in issue 6 of Fall to get inside Lockhaven when Midnight's army was at the gates. Panel 3. This is the same hallway shown in Fall and the Winter epilogue, where Midnight finds proof of the axe being real, which was M's book, where Kellanaw stores his gear, and where Liam gathers Kellanaw's belongings before departing Lockhaven as the Black Axe. You can even see some of the items on the shelves I've covered in previous commentaries from those books. Panel 4. To draw this panel, I used a reference photo of a spiral stairwell from Starkweather Chapel in Highland Cemetery in Ypsilanti, Michigan. It's being restored now, but years ago, back when it wasn't, I knew someone who had access to the long, locked, and falling apart space, and they offered me an exploratory tour and for photo references. I've wanted to include more from that building in Mouseguard, but I haven't found the right place to put it all yet. Page 20, Panel 1. As Kellanagh arrives in the matriarch office, I was very lucky to have the architectural model for this room I could just pull off the shelf when I needed to draw this space. Readers who have already gotten through fall and winter knew of this revolving portrait door. Just inside it, you can see that I've drawn Kellanagh has dropped off his gear there. Hanging on the wall is also that leaf sword that Liam uses at the end of Fall, which takes place almost 40 years later. On the mantle is the cloak of Faroon, a nod to the character in Jeremy Bastian's Legends of the Guard story, which suggests her as the first matriarch of the Guard. In the shadowy hallway is a tapestry based on a real tapestry my friend Eric Lynch's mom made for their church, featuring Jesus' mother Mary. I was taken with the design and craft of it and grabbed a photo of it at Eric and Rebecca's wedding and drew a mouse version with a matriarch for the 2010 sketchbook. Including it in this panel makes it an official Mouseguard artifact now. The floor is also covered in a different rug than during Gwendolyn's time. Panel 2. Even though this takes place prior to Fall, I did an update to the wall of bookcases on the right, and the hanging lamp and the chair are different than in Gwendolyn's time also. Panel 3. I never had shown what is down this hall before. I'd first drawn it in winter. It doesn't really appear in the Fall book, but as there aren't any panels showing a solid wall there, I had some room to expand the architecture. I think I originally added it so that there could be a passage that could lead to Gwendolyn's bedchambers, so she could go from rest to work without having to walk through all of Lockhaven. When I started working on these pages and needed to design the matriarch's chamber, not the bedchamber, I used a photo of an aerial view of the model in Photoshop to work up where that hallway leads, how the new room is situated, which was just a duplicate photo of the office, and left myself some room for another hallway off of this one that leads to the bedchambers. Panel 4. I explained that little doorway on the left in the cutaway of the matriarch's chamber for the hardcover extras, but this is an access point to light a narrow stone trough of lamp oil to illuminate the stained glass windows inside, which couldn't receive any natural sunlight based on the way I'd already drawn the exterior of Lockhaven. Kellanagh's call, "my love," is something Julia and I write to each other in cards. Page 21, Panel 1. And now we are finally inside the matriarch's chamber. I did an entire video here on my YouTube channel about that model, exploring it, its modularity, and the materials I made it from. Be sure to check it out. When I conceived of this room, I wanted it to be full of stained glass of past matriarchs, which was inspired from stained glass of the saints that I photographed in Christ Church in Dublin, Ireland. I'll go more into the matriarchs depicted in the hardcover extras commentary later. The tile floor pattern in the matriarch's chamber is also inspired from the tiles in that same church in Dublin. Julia and I took a trip to Northern Ireland and Ireland just before I started work on the Black Axe, and I came back with a lot of inspiration for it. Panel 2. This is an example of acting with body language rather than many facial features. That eye is so small, and there's only so much I can do with it, especially without eyebrows to convey emotion like other illustrators can with more human characters. The narration helps get the point across, but I think the idea that Kellanagh is shocked and horrified by what he sees is clear in the visuals of the arm and the hand placement alone. Panel 3. To get the text to curve in perspective with the bound book page, I typed the words and printed them out, placing that sheet of paper in an open book and photographed it. I then used that photo to ink over when inking the final art for the page. More loss for Kellanagh. The decree explains that Bronwyn was killed by a wolf at age 43, and that her written command is that guard mouse Eleanor becomes matriarch. Eleanor is a family name on Julia's side. I also printed another page meant to be opposite this decree of death, listing the current patrol route assignments in the spring of 1116. And while I cropped in tight enough in the final art that it was unused, I still have the printout. Here are some names of note. Bickett for P.J. Bickett, who was running Archaea at the time. Lucas, still at the Frostic outpost. Henson for Jim Henson, Odell, who is Kenzie's mentor, Laird, after Peter Laird, co-creator of the Ninja Turtles, Quigley, the lookout from Fall, and Bonnie, for a family friend, Bonnie Venn. Also, visible on the shelf behind the podium are a round ornamental ball from Guy Davis's Legends of the Guard story, and the bear canister from Alex Kane and Sean Rubin's Legends of the Guard story. Page 22, panel 1. This is an odd framing and angle, but I kind of like it. It really gives the impression Kellinaw is poring over this book, searching for an answer, for his name. As the line, "as though I never existed," is said, he is almost entirely visually blocked by this podium. The narration is a connection to what Gwendolyn writes about Kellinaw in her journal in the fall epilogue. Records indicate that he was at one time a guard, but mention of him suddenly ceases. I used everything I had written or mentioned about Kellinaw and the Black Axe in the previous books to be my landmarks of what this book had to work towards. Panel 2. Here is another printout page placed in a book and photographed to ink over so the curve of the text matches the contour of the page. Other guard mice inducted in 1100 are listed here, along with their mentors' names as well as the cloak colors. I gave them all an adjective to go with the color name, so that more an idea of the color's meaning came out, or so that there are subtle differences between shades and hues to allow more variation than just red, blue, green, etc. Panel 3. Acting. Another instance where selling the emotion is mostly done through the body language when I draw these mice. When I photographed the architectural model for reference, I propped up the little chipboard podium with a kneaded eraser. Panel 4. This is the same letter as seen in issue 1, but I redrew it from the opposite angle. Since I still had the prop note, it was easy to just rephotograph myself holding it so that this panel wasn't just a copy and paste of the old one. I struggled with this scene, this moment in particular, that Bronwyn would let Kellinaw go for this quest, assuming he'd never come back, either because he'd die in the quest or he'd become the Black Axe and need to be the anonymous champion, assuming M explained some of that lore to her. It explains away why his service records were removed. She couldn't stand the pain of losing him and seeing his name. We've all been through those kind of breakups, right? But also that if he were to become successful, she knew there could be no link to him and the guard. Sure, there would be guard mice alive who remember Kellinaw, but in a few generations' time, he would only be a legend and a myth. Page 23, panel 1. Another big room panel where that model was invaluable. This is not quite the last of Kellinaw's losses that the quest for the Black Axe has cost him, but it's probably the one that hits him the hardest. Losing the love that he came back for is also about losing the life he came back for, which includes his association with the guard. The stained glass window at the center of the end of the room is Faroon, the mouse matriarch from Jeremy Bastian's Legends of the Guard story. It was important for me to seed some of the Legends stories into this book as possibly or partially true. Jeremy's story was chief among those. Also seen near the holy hand grenade-like orb from Guy Davis's story and the bear canister from Sean and Alex's is one of the tooth horns from Legends of the Guard Volume 1, the hardcover jacket. It looks like the Scrimshaw work might suggest that this is Copperwood's horn, but I also wonder if I was implying that a sixth horn survived, since the details are a bit different. Panel 2. And yet another issue ends on an emotional note. Lost the ship and possibly his and everyone else's lives at the end of issue 2. Kellinaw headed into the Briar to face death with the Fox in issue 3. M died at the end of issue 4. And here we are with Kellinaw's most personal soul punch yet. But to lighten up the end of this commentary, I'll share with you something real-life Kenzie, Jesse Glenn, pointed out to me about this panel. That it looks like Kellinaw is playing the Black Axe like a guitar, getting some sweet licks in on that axe, rather than hugging it. Pin-up by Shane Michael Vidari. I met Shane at New York Comic Con when he stopped by my table to show me his illustration portfolio. If memory serves, it was the same year I met Sean Rubin there as well. Shane was doing all these great watercolor illustrations that had a lot of inset panels. I did a quick review of his portfolio, mostly praising the stuff that he was doing really successfully as illustrations. And I asked if he had ever done or considered doing comics, because there was a lot of storytelling there. After I got home, he sent me a little Saxon watercolor, thanking me for the advice and the review. I had it framed and sitting on my desk for several years. Apparently, the notion of Shane doing comics resonated with him as a way to create his own opportunities for work and for storytelling. He published an anthropomorphic graphic novel with Archaea called Iron, or The War After. We agreed to do a pinup exchange. I did one for Iron, of a tiger character from his book, and he did this one for The Black Axe, featuring Kellinaw, with his pipe as flower petals drift away in a watery blue palette to evoke M's river funeral. And that's the 5th issue of Mouseguard the Black Axe. It has been collected in a hardcover published by Archaea. If you enjoyed this commentary, please leave comments in the section below. Let me know what I didn't answer for you in this issue, and subscribe for updates when I add more Mouseguard commentary. Thank you for listening.